Hey there, this is Donnie Davis, and I wanted to share some ideas of extending the Good Life Research Network and some of our goals there to the idea of having a pedagogy network for the MCO researchers. So, what's the Good Life Research Network? I have a YouTube video where we kind of talk through some of the ideas there. We started out with the idea of having a mission or purpose to make the early career phase easier to navigate. I think I need to get back with Daryl and some of the others and extend that a little bit because I think it may be a little bit broader than that. I definitely think we have an early career focus, and we want to make that first phase easier to navigate. I think mid-career, we want to help people shift into a phase of leadership and building other people up. David Brooks has a book called Second Mountain where he talks about a shift from resume virtues to eulogy virtues. So starting to kind of think about success, not in terms of your own achievements, but also the impact that you have on other people's lives. And then I actually think there might be a third category that would be something like as people get towards the end of their careers and even into retirement, I think there might be a shift towards legacy and thinking about how to consolidate one's contributions to a discipline and to a profession and community. So what does this all have in common? I think it might overlap with some of the questions and things that Sally Lee and I have been wanting to learn from the Life Worth Living Network. And I think they're essentially asking questions about what matters most, how are people orienting to the good in their life, and trying to discern that with various cultural identities and influences. Why focus on being more intentional about building an MCO network now? There's a couple of reasons. One, I'm kind of just pulling some content together for a MCO course that's going to focus on cultural critiques of the wellness industry. And so this is a bit of a project, and I'm wanting feedback on some of these ideas. So we're just prepping content. We also just did an APA webinar. The webinar that we did is for the second edition of the Cultural Humility book. And we were able to include Karen Tao and Martin Kivligan. But I also, in sending resources out to the folks who are on that call, I wanted to spotlight a lot of the other people that have done work on MCO since we wrote the first book. The first book only had 2 or 3 years worth of empirical research going when we were trying to kind of put those conceptual ideas together. But now we have, almost a decade of scholarship, and more and more people are coming to contribute, not only in research, but there's a growing community of people who are integrating MCO into clinical training and even other areas, so like higher education leadership, consultation with organizations that are wanting to kind of integrate humility and other ideas from MCO into their approaches for training leaders. And so it seems like a good time to make sure that we cross-pollinate well, because sometimes the publication process can be a bit slow, and it would be good for us to kind of know what people are thinking about and developing, because there's probably at least a 2 to 3 year lag between some kind of the cutting edge of what people are thinking about and when that makes it into kind of a peer-reviewed article. So one thing that was a little bit fun about the webinar the other day is we got to hear everyone's version of like the origin story of MCO. Apparently Karen and Jesse were on internship, and they actually had the training director there on the webinar. So Jesse was able to give him a shout out. And they were kind of talking about a new way of thinking about training people to engage cultural themes in counseling. And, there was a general literature on broaching but a bit of a debate of how to go about that. And so cultural opportunities was kind of a more flexible way of framing, like, don't just broach cultural themes, in a rigid way. First session, just pushing it. The data wasn't necessarily supporting that, but maybe we need to have a different way of thinking about that, a little more from a common factors tradition. The cultural comfort language also is integrating, for anybody who's had kind of group counseling and maybe read Yalom, there's an attention to process. And so you're not just tracking the content of what's happening in a session, but you're also tracking your own internal experience. And so to what extent are you noticing your own feelings and possibly discomfort around cultural themes, and what do you do with that process, using that as information? So Karen talks a bit about this later in the webinar. Then there was something else. There's kind of a third pillar, and I was asking Jesse afterwards, like, what were y'all thinking about calling the third pillar before humility kind of locked into place as kind of the final pillar, or the final puzzle piece? And he said, talking about maybe cultural empathy, there were some other terms going around at the time, so they were kind of looking for something. And this is where, I think we all just look back on our careers, and there's just sometimes serendipity. Josh and I had been doing some initial work on humility. How we came to that work was everyone was kind of preoccupied with a possible measurement problem. So if you ask someone how humble they are, and they say, yeah, I'm like the most humble person I know, it could be that that's actually an arrogant thing to say. And then maybe someone who's higher in humility would actually, on a self-report, underestimate their humility. So how do you actually go about measuring something like that? So how we got connected to Jesse is we ran across one of the papers that he did on multicultural competencies, and he had applied kind of a common factors approach. So he had, let's say you've got a set of therapists and you have their client rate the therapist cultural competence. What he did is he wanted to show, is there any evidence linking cultural competence to better outcomes? And if I remember that paper correctly, what he found is there wasn't enough agreement across someone's clients to even do the second analysis where you look at the link between competencies and outcomes. And so, Josh and I read this paper and we're like, hey, that seems similar to the issues that we're looking at with humility. And by that point, we had kind of come to a multi-method approach where you need to triangulate not just self-report, but also other report and possibly some sort of behavioral observation. And so we got Jesse. We're like, Jesse, help us. We're trying to create a measure. There's a line of work on cultural humility within the health field, but most of the work is either conceptual or there's some qualitative work, but it would be nice if we had a way to study this and bring it into psychotherapy process research. And so that was kind of our initial paper that we wrote with Jesse. And then kind of at the same time, and I guess I'd have to get Josh to fill this in, I think we were early career and wanting to try our hand at writing a book. And so we just sent in a proposal to APA, but, we all kind of knew it would be helpful to have a team that had different perspectives. So we kind of already had Jesse helping us with the measurement paper, but Carlene had joined the faculty at Georgia State, and I was starting to talk with her about these ideas. And, I was like, Jesse and Josh, we should really get Carlene's perspective, because I was having a growing trust and respect for how not only her scholarly work, but how she was integrating some of this into her teaching and mentoring. And so that was kind of how our authorship team came together. And then as we finished that book, we wanted to kind of distill some of the main ideas from the book into an article so that it would be widely accessible to people. And that's where we brought in a variety of other people. So you've got some folks from Georgia State research team, you've got Josh and Jesse, and then David Rivera was trained with Daryl Wing Sue. And at the time we were kind of wrestling with, and it was a bit of internal conversation on our team, of how do we relate to the cultural competencies perspective. And so in this kind of first review paper, we probably softened a bit. So, I think anytime you're doing something new, there's you kind of need a little bit of space, and there's possibly even some kind of critique of the current paradigm. And so we had some language around, how as a trainee, focusing on how good you're doing may not be the right focus to kind of grow and get better. It can lead to kind of almost a perfectionism or a preoccupation with your own performance. But I think what we ended up kind of moving towards is a complementarity language, where the discourse system around competencies is a framing that takes the perspective of someone evaluating another person. It's almost like a coach perspective. There's a bit of a hierarchy to it. There's a top-down kind of gatekeeping, supervision, making sure that someone meets minimum standards of the field. And so that had a really important purpose in terms of signaling the values of the profession to having a shift towards valuing multiculturalism. So that was important, but then to translate these themes into an area where we could begin to develop research programs to study this in psychotherapy process, that required kind of a shift in perspective. And so the MCO kind of gave a way of doing that. And it's almost like the difference between third person and first person. So MCO is what it's like to be in, the cockpit, in the driving seat. And so you're orienting to what's happening in a session, and it's a first person view. So that kind of gave us a bit of a softer way of relating to the competencies tradition. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. There was a large grant that Joe Currier and Jesse Fox did that I think did a nice job of blending the two and kind of smoothing some of that over. And I hope other people will continue to build on that foundation. Sort of joking around, what's the seminal paper that should be cited for MCO? We probably need a new citation that includes personal communication between Jesse and Karen. And I think that gets you to cultural opportunities and cultural comfort. And then I think Jesse, in his early career address paper, he kind of adds in cultural humility. And then you have Josh's paper. I wish we had something that at least had Karen, Jesse, Josh, me, Kerlene, David Rivera, anyway, we didn't do that perfectly. But kind of, as I mentioned at that quote at the beginning, it really isn't about credit. Jesse, as you kind of see in this origin story, and I do think this story is characteristic of how he's invested in other early career scholars. Josh and I cold called him and randomly asked for his support, and he generously gave it, not knowing us at all. So, I think that does speak to the spirit of our network. We're hoping to be a generative place that brings in lots of new people wanting to do research and integrate these ideas into their training practices. And we're not just focused on training clinicians. We think this has implications for all sorts of leadership contexts, anything that has to do with dealing with people. In this section, I wanted to just give some sense of what happened in the first 10 years to expand MCO into new areas. And so the example I think of is, I've got 3 kids. Catherine is now 17, but around the time we were writing the book, she was of the age of the Frozen movies. So I think of the song Into the Unknown. If you want to listen to that, you can. I'm not going to violate copyright infringement. So I think one of the first areas you see expansion is Josh had a colleague at University of North Texas, Ed Watkins. They wrote some papers extending this into supervision, and I think their first few papers were conceptual. And then Mel Wilcox, Stephanie Winklejohn Black, and others started to do empirical work extending MCO to supervision. So that added a layer of complexity. It was kind of interesting. Colleen commented the other day, it's funny that a lot of the people that did that work, their last name started with a W. So we got the supervision WWW. Another frontier that happened early and I think was really important for establishing the credibility, the empirical credibility of work on multicultural orientation and cultural humility, is Martin Kivligan applied MCO to group psychotherapy. And having done my dissertation, kind of trying to use a personality judgment perspective, and I kind of started to learn about dyadic approaches and, for example, more complex methods of handling dyadic data, including round robin data, where like if you have a group and each member rates everybody in the group, different ways of handling that data. Martin published a number of papers in our top outlet in counseling psychology within the first few years of his career. And that was a major contribution to MCO scholarship. So as I was kind of pulling references for people who were on this webinar call, I was pulling screenshots from EndNote, and you can kind of see how many papers that Martin contributed early on. So that was huge when we were doing the revision, very helpful. And I think if you start to look at some of the findings from his papers, it's complicated. There's different ways of thinking about what cultural humility is. Are you looking at cultural humility of the leader from perspectives of people in the group? Or does it matter what the culture of the group is? And let's say you have a group that's predominantly from one cultural group. How does that affect how you interpret what these scores mean? And so real life is complicated when you start to look at the empirical findings from MCO. This is where I wanted to address a few frequently asked questions that I remember even in our first talk or first couple of talks at APA, these questions came up right away. And I'll mention people who've written papers that begin to address those questions, and you could use those to integrate them into a course. So one of the early questions is for people who are in different groups focused on social justice advocacy, there's a question of how do you integrate MCO into a broader process of cultural commitment to advocacy. And so as people are kind of acculturating to the profession and beginning to get a sense of what they're trying to do with their careers, one reaction that people are having is this is focused on what it's like to do either individual psychotherapy or counseling or group, but there's a growing conversation in counseling psychology, and I think similar conversations in social work, marriage and family therapy, of one of the roles that we have as professionals is to be involved in institutional leadership within organizations. And part of what we want to do is advocate for systemic changes that benefit our clients, students in higher ed, possibly getting involved in advocacy politically. So, for example, APA has varying lobbying branches within Washington, D.C. And so there are many other roles that a psychologist might occupy And what does MCO have to say about those things? And I could say a couple things there. We had one response that was pragmatic, and it was just to emphasize that if you counted up the number of sessions that happen across the U.S., and if you included master's level counselors, psychologists, and let's say you also included various types of lay counselors, clergy who might be influenced by the ideas within MCO, then it's a huge amount of people. It is a larger system. And so it's not that it's not important to kind of impact training practices within the helping professions, application to teachers, especially if we extend it to leadership. But I think one of the papers that's worth reading is Mel Wilcox and a number of other authors wrote a paper on structural competencies, and they're tapping a model within the health system that had been developed and saying, hey, can we learn from this to integrate an aspect of how we're training, that we're training people to work within a system and work to improve systems so that they're not, large systems have a way of sometimes being insensitive to context. A second paper I'd point out that Andres wrote with some other folks is a kaleidoscope model of MCO. And we have a talk that he gave at MSTAR last year. If people wanted to access that, you could check in with Andres. But he's reviewing a paper that they recently got published in Journal of Counseling Psychology. It's a qualitative study within the jail system. The jail system is an example of a system where there's a potential for dehumanization. And what does it mean for the therapists to work in that space in a way that's attentive to the context and honors human dignity, even within a context that can be very dehumanizing to people. I think if you're interested in kind of broaching themes of how to hold power institutionally and work within systems, or even potentially put pressure on systems from the outside, these two papers are a great way to get the conversation going. And I think this is a good area for MCO folks to talk about what seems to work in terms of holding space for these kinds of conversations. In some of the content that Sally and I have about MCO wellness, we mention that group leaders may have to make a decision about the purpose of their group. And it could be important to leave people some space that the goals of their careers may be different. So for example, if I am an administrator in Texas functioning within a system that is right now 2025, there's a real debate about how administrators engage diversity themes. I'm going to have different ways of thinking about how to negotiate my role than if I'm doing one-on-one counseling versus if I'm a citizen and I'm potentially involved in political activism. And, we'd also want to acknowledge we are not assuming that people all belong to the same political party. So it's a complex society and a complex world. And so how do we hold space to have these conversations, given that people have different values and are coming to these issues with different goals and within different roles? A second frequently asked question is, what do we do? I like your ideas about cultural humility. I like your ideas about opportunities and comfort. Okay, now what? And here I want to really thank Jesse Fox and Joe Currier, because they did a large project with the John Templeton Foundation where they put a team together and they were really trying to have a spirit of professional collaboration. They brought together teams from 4 different sub-professions, so clinical psych, counseling psych, so psychology, counselor education and practice, so Jesse Fox is from the counseling profession, marriage and family therapy, and social work. And so they had a large team, probably at least 10 to 15 people just on the grant team. And Jesse Fox then ran an RFP where he invited more teams to do kind of smaller projects. So a number of folks interested in MCO were funded to do projects on this deal, and it got us talking to each other. And in particular, one of our goals was to address the skills gap. So people have talked about how there's quite a bit of work on how to grow in self-awareness. There's quite a bit of literature on knowledge, how to grow in knowledge around different cultures. But when it comes to the what do we do, that's actually a gap of the larger profession. So I wanted to give you some sense of the experimentation that happened just within this project. But this is an example of how we need to talk with each other, because it will probably be 3 or 4 years before we can kind of synthesize all of the publications that came from that work. There's some really cool work that I'm aware of that we ought to share with each other, and vice versa. So things other people are working on, it would be nice to have an avenue to kind of cross-pollinate and not have to wait on the slow wheels of publication progress. So I wanted to spotlight a couple of things. I can talk to you a little bit about some of the things our lab has done, but Stephanie has a YouTube page that is one of the first things I send to people if they're wanting to kind of integrate skill practice from an MCO perspective. And what's really cool about this is, one, it's free. It aligns with the deliberate practice paradigm and kind of ideas around expertise development, that to get better at something, you have to kind of keep practicing and then getting feedback on your practice. And there are some companies like Skillsetter. Bruce Wampold has a company that has thousands of these videos, but it does cost students money. It's about $75 per student. If you're doing research with it, oftentimes he'll let you do research for free because they're trying to build their base of videos and get more scholarship on this. But I think there are more and more people kind of moving towards this kind of practice approach. So Bruce has a podcast where he talks about facilitative interpersonal skills. So this is one of the first examples where you have people do something outside of therapy. So they're responding to these kind of tricky interpersonal situations. And the coding of their responses ends up predicting therapy outcomes. So this is exciting because it provides a possible link of how to help people grow and to show, if you can grow in dealing with challenging situations in practice and get feedback on that, it might improve your outcomes as a clinician. What is really exciting to me about Stephanie's project is she gave some challenging cultural situations. These involve the intersection of spirituality with other cultural identities. And then she also gives people responses from a variety of clinicians that do work in this area. And they not only give a response of what they would do, but then they talk about that. So this is an extremely engaging way to integrate cultural themes into a course. Sally and I have done a few lectures where they'll ask us to come in and kind of talk about religion and spirituality on the day that's covered in our master's level multicultural course. And what we've started to do lately is we'll do a little bit of conceptual work, but then we'll bring in a case and we'll just let people talk about it in dyads, and then we'll have a group discussion. And it's so much better than just reading about a case, because when you hear someone's voice, and I'm actually not sure the video is crucial, but just to kind of hear another person talking, it engages empathy in a different way that makes it very evocative, and it allows for kind of conversation that facilitates the type of discernment and wisdom and perspective taking that you'd want to cultivate in a class like that. So I could easily see us doing much more of this kind of thing, of providing pedagogical resources that we share with each other. And, you know, there's certainly money to be made, but I kind of like the idea of giving this away, that we would give access to this, especially to early career scholars, so that it helps them with their content preparation in their first few years, because prepping a new course is quite a bit of work. Another project that I wanted to spotlight was Jennifer Ripley, who is an expert in couples interventions and training clinicians to work with couples and families. So she brings themes from systems theory and integrates those with an MCO perspective. And so she has some really cool concepts. So for example, they apply ideas around differentiation of self and a type of emotional maturity where someone isn't too distant or enmeshed, but kind of has a balance of being able to stay in touch with themselves while being connected to other people. Another concept, it's kind of jargony, but there's a theorist who talks about multi-directional impartiality. And so there's kind of an idea of when you're working with a system that you would have a type of empathy where you're fully attending and kind of affirming, but then you're also holding a certain stance where you're not picking a side. And so there's kind of this delicate dance or balance of both affirming, but not getting triangled into conflict, but kind of having a stance that's going to be for the system and for the relationship if it's a couple. So many couples clinicians will talk about something like that, of how to balance your role, and that it's different than individual counseling. And so I think there's some themes that were really helpful from her course for thinking about what it's like just to train people for teaching. So teaching is kind of similar to learning to facilitate groups. It's really a type of psychoeducational group. And so this course was great. She put everything into a YouTube channel and actually did a study on it. I think this is a good model of what others could do, because if we get into the habit of sharing our content with each other, then it's going to make it a lot easier for early career folks to kind of prep their courses. It's kind of like, you know, folks who grew up with a cell phone, they're not used to reading like 70-page review articles. And so for us to kind of orient them to the field and make this interesting, we may have to start closer to kind of some of the modalities that they're used to engaging information. Yeah, at some point they probably are going to have to learn to read more dense kind of technical papers if they want to make a scientific contribution. But we can kind of go to them in many ways too and help them develop a love for some of the work and the ideas, so that they've got the motivation to do some of the more technical work. So these are just two examples. I took a screenshot of a variety of other projects. Many of these projects integrated MCO constructs because Joe and Jesse and others encourage people to use some common measures. So this really was a double bounce for MCO, because it not only introduced it to a variety of scholars, but those scholars are placed in a variety of different professions, not just psychology. I'm also happy to send any of the stuff that we did. So Nathaniel Wade and Josh did a clinical trial of so Nathaniel's a group expert. He trained peer facilitators, so graduate students, to lead groups to kind of hold a space for people to learn some foundational information about different religious groups, the 5 major world religions, plus some information about people leaving religion or people who are agnostic or atheist. And then the work that Sally and I, Aaron McLaughlin, Jamie and Coleman, we did some work at Georgia State to integrate skill practice into the systematic measurement across several master's programs. And we also built, kind of similar to what Stephanie was doing, we created free videos that could be integrated into courses, and an approach to doing that and an approach to sharing those. So basically put everything into one slide deck where all you'd have to do is pull a slide and put it into your lecture, and you've got the video right there. So it's really easy to see how we could create cross-pollination that would make it easier to integrate each other's stuff into our courses. The other thing that I'll try to do is anyone that has lectures, talks, whatever, I'll try to synthesize that content. If you've got stuff on YouTube, it's very easy. All I got to do is just create a slide deck and put those videos in a shared slide deck, and I can kind of, aggregate, synthesize the content, and then people can use it for whatever they want. Okay, this next section of frequently asked questions, I called, what about when humility doesn't seem safe? This is a bit of a funny story. Early on, I'm kind of an expansive thinker, and I kept asking Jesse, are you sure that there's only 3 pillars? Sure seems like there's other things we could talk about. And Jesse was good. He kept me from expanding us to 6 or 7 pillars. But I do think what you will see is a more nuanced and complex way of framing even humility. Probably means that we're going to be talking more dialectically, and depending on the cultural identities of the clinician, or it could be a different role, a teacher, a chair of a department, a dean, could be a citizen doing political advocacy. So depending on what the role is and the cultural identities, there may be a type of balancing that is needed. And so I've got a lecture y'all are willing to listen to, where I kind of use the analogy of Where's Waldo? And I say that even within the 3 pillars, I think there's a hidden virtue within cultural opportunities and cultural comfort. So I'll leave that as a teaser. Moon and Sandage wrote one of the more important critiques of the MCO, and you should definitely read the paper, but kind of a synthesis question is, how do we need to nuance how we understand or talk about cultural humility or other aspects of MCO when the clinician may be from a marginalized group and there may be power dynamics that are pretty complicated that are unfolding in a session? So an example might be, you have a woman of color in a session, and you have a man, it's a white man in the session. The white man is not only kind of demonstrating a certain kind of dominance within the session, and there's kind of power dynamics, but then there are cultural offenses that are happening within the session. Maybe we haven't said enough about cultural humility just to send someone in to that kind of environment. Maybe we need to say more about what it means to emphasize being wise about one's own personal boundaries and safety. What is it that we're training people to do when they're encountering tricky situations involving various types of power dynamics? In the most recent version of the book, we made sure to include examples where we attend to some of those nuances. If you read Moon and Sandage's paper, part of where they go is that there needs to be attention to the broader ecology of the training system and just the entire system that's interacting with clients. So it wouldn't be good if you have a system that's generally culturally pretty rigid and expecting high levels of assimilation to kind of the dominant norms of that system, and it's not very culturally flexible or humble. If that system is just putting a bunch of assimilation pressure on clinicians of color within the system, that's not good. How could you introduce some of these themes in a course? I think we did a better job in the book, but it's not perfect. There's a talk that Carleen gave at MSTAR a couple of years ago that I think would be good. I can see if she's open to sharing that talk with folks. Karen Tao has a couple of talks that I would highly recommend on cultural fortitude. And I think this language that she's using does kind of contextualize. So there's a kind of cultural discomfort that could happen engaging cultural dynamics that really aren't appropriate. And it's not okay, but a clinician is still in an entrusted role to care for a person. So what do you do? So I would highly recommend those. She gave a talk last year at MSTAR applying multicultural orientation to polarization. And another person that I want to spotlight is Laura Kaptari and her work on virtue bypass. So the idea here is it's possible for virtue language to be used in an exploitive way in a system. And it's really the difference between if I am using humility language to orient my own life, and that is helpful for me to kind of think about where I'm headed, what I'm trying to do, how I'm trying to have integrity as a psychologist, that's probably helpful. If there's someone who's abusing their power, they have authority over me, and they're using humility language in a coercive way, well, that's not going to be helpful. It's going to actually really interfere with my development. So I think there is a really important conversation to have about just because we say humility doesn't mean that that language is trustworthy. So what does it mean for us to help people learn to attend to their power, attend to their roles within an organization, and use that in a way that's trustworthy and not overly coercive? I want to spotlight Jamie and Coleman. So he extends MCO into the area of addictions. And at the beginning of his talk, he'll often ask people, how many of you came into the field wanting to do addictions work? And in the average room, many people say, no, that wasn't an initial draw. And then he'll say, well, how many of you who are practicing see this regularly in your clients? And all the hands go up. So I think he's extending the frontiers of MCO to some areas where the average counselor or psychologist kind of comes in with affinities of where they want to go and serve. But I think he's trying to create an attractive vision that we'd be willing to go and serve where the needs are and not just necessarily where we feel comfortable or want to go. So definitely would want to spotlight his work. He created a certificate program at the University of Tennessee that received a grant and is disseminating this content widely. And so I think it's an illustration of some of the innovations that can happen in pedagogical practice, especially in the counseling field. And we know, given the great mental health needs of our society, that many of the people that are going to be doing frontline work are going to be master's level clinicians. So I think this is really important. Also, shout out to Franco Dispenza, who gave an excellent talk relating MCO to disability justice at MSTAR last year. And then finally, I wanted to spotlight a paper by Elise Choi. So she did a scoping review, and I think she had high hopes that there would be more to synthesize. So she tried to find, kind of all of the papers dealing with what's it like for clinicians of color to experience microaggressions or other kinds of offenses in therapy. And she found a whopping, I think, 4 articles. So it wasn't good, probably a little embarrassing for fields that are wanting to kind of focus on some of these areas. So this is an important paper, and it's a gap that needs to be addressed. But one of the things that she adds to the mix, kind of building on the Moon and Sandage paper, is humility language might not be enough. We probably need a dialectic that brings in other kinds of language. And one of the terms that she brings in is wisdom. So I'm seeing that concept of kind of a practical wisdom. So within the philosophy area, that's a pretty important part of Aristotle's framework. So the virtue ethics folks put a lot of emphasis on this. And part of the idea is that when you're dealing with context and kind of knowing the right thing to do at the right time in the right situation for the right reasons, that requires a type of discernment. And so someone we actually ought to pick his brain a bit is Blaine Fowers. He's a counseling psychologist, and I think he wrote a recent book on phronesis, is the Greek term for that kind of practical wisdom. So thanks, Elise, for that contribution. I think that's going to end up being a really important way to tie together some of the dialectical thinking that's starting to come up. And if you look at the work coming out of the Danielson Institute, Elise spent some time there and trained there. Laura Kaptari is there. Steve Sandage, Sarah Moon was there for a bit. I think they're bringing in some really important conceptual language that might help us frame some of these issues around contextualization. And this next section, I called this the unknown unknown. I was almost thinking back to my group counseling course. Jim Siwi used the Johari window. And so there's some things that we know we don't know, and then there's other things that might even be beyond that. They're kind of unknown to self, unknown to others. And I think some of these topics kind of tap the boundaries of where we don't even really know what we may have to deal with in the future of MCO scholarship and kind of integration into training. So first, let's basically have a stance that views all criticism of MCO as good. As we may not agree with it, but we can always learn from it, and we can always rethink our perspective based on the ideas that are being addressed. I'll give you an example of one that I'm sitting with and not quite sure where to go with it. But, one is Patrick Guzanka has a couple of papers where he kind of points out that the intersectionality language that was used in some of the early MCO papers would fit closer to a weaker intersectionality versus what he's calling a stronger intersectionality. And I think that would be kind of fascinating to hear different MCO folks relate to. And I suspect it's a place where people's roles and responsibilities may affect how they kind of situate to that critique. So, for example, I think part of where he's coming from is if you're going to draw on intersectionality language, that's coming from a womanist tradition that's actually an interdisciplinary perspective. And there's a normative commitment, almost either theological or almost secular, theological, philosophical, where there's a clear ethical grounding and commitment that is important to retain if you're going to draw on these traditions of Black feminist scholars. If you wanted to get a sense of that, there's a couple of podcasts by Stacey Floyd Thomas. And I had a chance to meet her at kind of a consultation with Marissa Wolf's group where people were just presenting different papers. And she gave a very powerful kind of paper critique of using humility language. And part of what she was saying, you could kind of hear more of her expression of this in a podcast she did with that group. But what Stacey was saying is there's implicit power context that's often used with any kind of virtue language. And so what, just practically, just to show the group what she was saying, she said, so she would add the racial adjective before humility to contextualize the power dynamics. So if we were to say white humility versus Black humility, she was basically saying that gets at if you were to talk to Black religious leaders about the use of humility, there's a power context. And so in many cases in the Black church, she was describing that the virtue language that's used within a community is contextualized to a process of empowering the church and not internalizing racism and not assimilating to the broader culture. And so I think we can learn from some of these critiques coming from other disciplines to be more careful with our language and not assume that just because we say something, it's going to be good or even trusted by other people when we use virtue language. So you could apply something similar with the context of political polarization. So if you have a classroom that has a mix of political identities, you can't assume that when you use humility language that it means the same thing to everybody or that everyone trusts you in the same way to use that language. Another exciting frontier and totally unknown is the area of AI. How's this going to affect society? You read some things and it sounds really scary. On the other hand, some people think that there's kind of a exaggeration of what's going to happen, or it may be much slower. Who knows? But I will say Jesse is collaborating with a variety of people on the cutting edge of making good use of the innovations that AI may provide. So he has an MCO training where people can learn about MCO, practice on a set of really high quality videos. You know, they can practice applying the skills. And then they've developed AI generated feedback. So one of the problems of trying to use some of these methods of skill development is it's just really time intensive. And so how far can we get letting people practice on their own and get feedback that's generated from AI? So that's really exciting. And there's some initial papers that he also has around automated coding of MCO. So anyone who's doing research, this is, you know how time intensive it is to have, let's say you wanted like 5 people to go through 500 videos. That's hundreds and hundreds of hours of life. Another area that I think is going to become increasingly important is the integration of ethics. So when I heard that APA was revising the ethics code. I got kind of interested in this because I heard that they were wanting to add some, we have aspirational themes that address culture, but they were wanting to integrate culture into some of the guidelines that are enforceable. And so in our first MSTAR meeting, we invited Evelyn Hunter, who's at Auburn, to come talk about how she's thinking about ethics. She was on the committee that was working on that. She chaired that committee for a little while. I think she's off it now, but she paid her dues on that committee for a while. I think that work is still ongoing. So we actually have like a 90-minute talk by her that folks could listen to where she's, kind of bringing in humility themes. She wrote a book on how to address competence problems. And as a training director, and particularly during kind of the COVID period, I can say I talked to a variety of training directors, and most of them seem to be getting kind of burned out during that period. And so one of the just hardest kind of situations for a program to deal with is when you're holding authority, when you have a certain power, and then you have cultural dynamics occur in the program, how do you handle those in a way that doesn't lead to rupture? Because what can happen is if you have a student and they're getting feedback on their work and possibly a type of discipline, remediation, or some of those kinds of processes, that can be very painful for a program. And it's hard to know how to navigate that well. And so this is an excellent book. I read the whole thing as soon as I found it within like a day or two, that kind of gets in the ballpark of that area. And I haven't seen a full integration of MCO into how to think about that. But if you look at the broader literature on humility, one of the kind of theories of humility is that it involves a type of prosociality, a type of trustworthiness in relationships when a person holds power to exploit a relationship. So one of the personality theories kind of differentiates humility from agreeableness. And they say agreeableness is kind of trustworthiness when you're in a position of possibly lower power. And humility, honesty, humility, has to do with how you are trustworthy holding power. So I don't think we've nearly said enough about that area. And I think this is getting increasingly more complicated as different states regulate what can be integrated into K through 12 related to diversity themes, as well as pushback on diversity within higher education. And so in many ways, this brings us to similar kind of training of where our ethics code may not perfectly match the law. And so how is it that we handle ethical deliberation when we're needing wisdom to kind of discern how to act? So in a talk at APA, those are the two areas actually that I said we should develop more work on ethics for. One is issues related to burnout prevention. We know that when people get burned out, that's an ethical issue. So how do we have training practices? We shouldn't just say, we preach wellness, but we're not very good at it. We should stop saying that and just change our training practices. And then number two, it's very quick. You basically could be in a doctoral program and you feel frustrated with your role and lack of power. And then within 2 to 3 weeks, you could be teaching a course and you have the power to affect someone's life as an instructor. And it's just a rapid switch that can happen. And if you do a good job, you may be training director, chair of your department, dean, provost, counseling psychologists, counselor educators, helping professionals often get brought into organizational leadership within higher ed or other areas. And so we need to have more conversations about what it means to hold institutional authority. And so our lab is starting to invest in kind of a seminar course where we're reading books and kind of talking with each other about some of these themes. We're also trying to do some fellowships that would just connect early career folks to be able to talk about some of these situations and how they're handling them. So I wanted to end with a couple of thoughts on where my lab's headed. I like the idea of the skill practice, but there's a part of it, if you think about what it really means to develop a lifelong growing process, I don't see myself spending 10,000 hours watching hypothetical situations that are 30 seconds to 2 minutes. I think that's an earlier part of the process. But the part that excites me is applying the same principles of deliberate practice to more complex skills. And so I can just give you a taste of some of the things that we're talking about on my team. How do we grow in more sophisticated skills of wisdom and kind of growing throughout your career, a kind of maturity that would lead to counselor formation? If CBT is like 8 to 12 weeks, what does it look like to do long-term growth? That kind of idea. You could track some of the cultural critiques of psychology and kind of epistemic injustice. Kind of pulled a couple papers. And it's clear to me that we don't necessarily know what we don't know. How do we move forward when there are really different perspectives about how to do that? I had an experience with a peer consultation group that kind of spontaneously happened within our department. Jamie and Coleman, Aaron McLaughlin, and some other folks were involved in that. And then over the last couple of years, Sally, Lee, and I have been kind of integrating this into a strength-focused approach as we've been engaging the pedagogical network at Yale. And so we're trying to kind of put these things together. So if I was going to have you engage something from counseling psych, Joel Wong gave a talk where kind of a summary is it's not enough to just stop cultural offenses. We also have to look at, he called it microaffirmations, but what are the positive social actions that will build trust in a way that would result in more just relational systems. So this is a really important idea and paper, and I think there's a deep integrity behind the ideas of this paper that Joel and others published. So what does it look like to do that? Sally and I have been leaning into, as we're not quite sure what this looks like, to leave space for different epistemic perspectives and worldviews and normative frames, possibly even fundamental differences of even our most cherished ideas about what science is and knowledge creation. So we're learning from other disciplines. Life Worth Living has 4 principles. I think they're not bad as a starting place. I mean, I guess we could see if we had better ideas, but one is we're pursuing existential meaning. What matters? What matters most to me, to us? A second piece is there's a commitment to truth-seeking pluralism. So we're not okay saying that the strong can take what they want from the weak, kind of a morally nihilistic view. So we're going to reject that. Not sure how. We're going to make space for people to bring their full selves to the work and share ideas about how they understand what matters most and what's right and wrong, and how not to, how to reject kind of a nihilistic worldview. So that's hard work. It certainly takes us outside of the domain expertise of empirical science and into interdisciplinary scholarship and likely multi-method approaches, a stronger valuing of the role of qualitative work because it retains the perspective of persons, and persons have dignity, foundational dignity. There's a commitment to first-person engagement, so there's a big difference between hypothetical conversations and, so especially in that peer consultation group, what we found is conversations were more interesting and seemed to be more helpful when someone came and brought a real life situation that they were dealing with, and they kind of owned the perspective of it. So other people could kind of share their perspective of what was going on, but at the end of the day, the person who brought the issue had to integrate next steps into their own responsibility for their role working with a client, and they had to integrate it somehow with their own values, having had a chance to get ideas from other people. And then a fourth principle that they have is community of practice. So to really grow and do this work, we need strong friendships where we trust each other enough to share not just where we feel confident and comfortable, but our areas of fear, insecurity, other emotions that are less comfortable. So Sally and I wrote a paper applying some of these ideas related to structural humility. So humility isn't something that you just possess by yourself, but it might be a quality that emerges when people work together. So there's a collective piece to that. So we apply it first to using skill practice in courses, and that would kind of be a more intro level approach. Then we also describe an approach to peer consultation. And there's a key step where you're not only getting perspectives from the group. So someone puts skin in the game, they share an issue where they're asking for feedback. This is, commonly used in case consultation. You get different perspectives. It's more egalitarian than group supervision. So there's kind of a sense of we're all sharing perspectives with each other. It's less evaluative. And then one key difference is we had a step where we would ask other people outside of our department. So maybe one person from within the department, but outside of our group. And then if it involved a religious group, we might ask a religious leader from a somewhat similar tradition. We might ask someone who was within our profession, but also identified with that cultural tradition, and just get their perspective, masking details of the case. And what this would often do is it would generate, kind of like when you give multiple tests, you're learning to give, intelligence tests or personality tests, and you kind of integrate different sources of information. You put more weight where there's convergence. You start to kind of think more when you see discrepancies. So it was a similar kind of process. And what we realized is this is part of the way that we can start to develop a practical wisdom, kind of drawing on some of Elise's ideas, is we can get into the habit of checking our assumptions. And we may still end up realizing that we disagree with some of the perspectives that we end up getting, but it starts to at least surface some of the assumptions that we had even as a group. And then the third area that we talked about was bringing in explicit ethical dilemmas and using the same kind of peer consultation process to discuss ethical dilemmas. So that does naturally lead to the last area. So I'm currently working on a paper with some folks on an idea of MCO and wellness, and we talk about a radically inclusive approach to interdisciplinary and interprofessional collaboration. So if you're training to be a professor in any of these areas, you likely are going to need to develop interdisciplinary skills just to compete for grants. And there's a growing emphasis in certain settings on integrated behavioral health. And so in many cases, they're wanting to bring in mental health professionals to work alongside physicians and other people within a health system to kind of help promote better patient care. And so some of these movements within larger health systems, hospitals, VAs are requiring psychologists, counselors, social workers to work better with each other. In prior points in our history, there was kind of a competition that was existing within the market, and people were kind of carving up their particular angle on getting business. But if we think about how to train students now, they need to be prepared to kind of move in and out of different spaces and have a less competitive approach. And I think one of the things, if you kind of look at the structural humility that we were talking about with that peer consultation group, a similar kind of mentality is needed to learn from other professional groups, because it may be that we have problems that we're not aware of, and just interacting with others and them being like, why do y'all do that? Why are you thinking about it that way? Will kind of surface some of our assumptions, and it will at least give us a chance to reconsider and rethink some of the things that may be a mistake. Or who knows, we may learn that we're really proud of the way that we're doing things and the way that we're thinking about things. But that interdisciplinary contact can be really helpful, even in the process of professional acculturation. So if I were going to kind of give you one thing to begin to initiate that conversation in a class, I would point out a paper by Daniel Gutierrez, and I pulled a screenshot of that, but it's really cool. He's reading widely, and he's asking a question of like, what if our prevention really was going to make a difference in the real world? What would it have to look like? And I found myself really inspired by some of the ways that he was thinking about it. We need systems that currently don't work together to work together. There needs to be a really different level of accepting influence from each other, cooperating, collaborating, learning from each other, or we're going to still be talking about these same problems 50 to 100 years from now. Something has to shift even in the way that we're working together if we really expect some of these things to get better. So that's a bit of a tour of some of the exciting new directions that I think MCO has taken. I think you see a clear progression into new areas of empirical work. And I think one of the things that has helped MCO is that it has begun to address the empirical gap that people had discussed. So after, a couple of decades of cultural competency scholarship, there was a lack of work showing that what we were doing in training could actually improve clinicians' outcomes. And so I think MCO started to fill that empirical gap, and it situated some of the multicultural scholarship in a way that could be studied within psychotherapy process work. And now we're needing high levels of creativity to contextualize this to training and training people in a variety of different roles and settings. And all the while, people are just wanting to grow in their careers and practice in a way that's sustainable, and they're enjoying their work and thriving in their lives, because there are elements of this work that are really hard. And so we have to have a balance of doing hard work, but also doing that work and training in a way that is sustainable and that we're growing. And so I think the note that I would want to leave us with is, I think we want to be a community that's modeling for students that we need to do this work together. This is a team sport. I know my mentor said that research is a team sport. So I very much think that the work of teaching and training people is also a team sport. And so what we want to model is a spirit of collaboration and teamwork. So we're going to talk about difficult concepts. We're not going to move away from things that are hard, but there is a valuing of if we were to bump into something that puts a friendship on the line, we value our friendships with each other and we're going to attend to those relationships. And there is a certain foundation of us committing to each other. And it's not hypothetical. There's a relational connection and commitment that we have to each other. And so I have really enjoyed learning from Steve Sandage and the conversations they're having at Danielson, because the dialectical framing, I feel like, gives me a way of not having to do either or, but kind of have a both and language for some of the things that we're talking about and some of the challenges that kind of across settings we're bumping into in terms of trying to apply these ideas.